During the wedding toasts, my son stood up with a glass he could barely hold steady. His voice cracked as he said, "I never thought I'd have to say this out loud." The room leaned in. Then my daughter-in-law crossed the floor, leaned close, and whispered something only he could hear. He froze, sat down, said nothing. She didn't look back at him, not once. That's when I knew. Everything I'd suspected for years was true. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me thank you for your continuous support. If you love stories like this one, support us by subscribing to this channel and comment where you are watching us from. It will be great to hear from you. Now let's jump into the details of what happened. I noticed the shaking before anyone else did, because when you raise a child from the day they first curl their fingers around yours, you learn their tells long before they learn how to hide them. My son had always had steady hands. Even as a boy, even when he was nervous, even when he was standing at the edge of a swimming pool pretending not to be afraid, his hands never betrayed him. They were calm, deliberate, certain. That's why the way his fingers trembled around the stem of that glass hit me like a quiet alarm no one else could hear. A soundless warning that something underneath the surface had been broken for a long time and was only now trying to breathe. The room was loud that night, full of overlapping laughter and clinking silverware and the soft hum of people who thought they were gathered for celebration. It was an anniversary dinner, not a wedding, but it had the same energy people bring when they believe a story has already reached its happy ending. Long tables, warm lights, glasses half full, smiles practiced and easy. I sat near the end, watching instead of talking, because somewhere along the way I'd learned that fathers who watch tend to survive truths longer than fathers who interrupt them. My son stood up slowly, like the floor beneath him had suddenly turned unreliable, and when he cleared his throat, the room began to quiet the way it always does when someone believes they're about to hear something meaningful. "I never thought I'd have to say this out loud," he began, and in that moment, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Those weren't the words of a man giving a polite toast. Those were the words of someone stepping toward a cliff edge, unsure whether he'd be pushed or jump on his own. His eyes didn't meet mine. They didn't meet anyone's. They stayed fixed somewhere just above the crowd, as if he were reading from a script only he could see, and his grip tightened around the glass like it was the last solid thing in his world. I didn't look at my daughter-in-law right away. That's something people misunderstand about suspicion. They think it announces itself loudly, with accusations and raised voices. But suspicion is quieter than that. It lives in the small gaps between words, in the moments when someone answers a question that wasn't directed at them, in the way a person slowly disappears without ever officially leaving. I had felt it for years with her, long before I had language for it. She was charming in public, efficient in private, and always positioned just close enough to my son that her presence could be mistaken for support instead of supervision. People called her strong. They called her decisive. They called her the better half, and laughed, not realizing how accurate that phrase might have been. Before my son could finish his sentence, before he could even take the next breath, she stood. No hesitation, no embarrassment, no apology. She crossed the room with the confidence of someone who didn't need permission to interrupt a moment that didn't belong to her. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, a sound that cut through the quiet more sharply than any shout could have, and when she leaned in toward him, she didn't look at his face. She looked at his ear, like that was where control lived. She whispered something short, efficient, measured, the kind of sentence you rehearse long before you ever need to use it. My son stopped moving. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else noticed. He simply deflated. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His jaw tightened once. Then he sat back down without a word, placing the glass carefully on the table like he was afraid it might shatter if he didn't treat it gently. She turned away immediately, not even glancing back to see if he followed, because she already knew he would. And that was the moment I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. That was the moment everything I'd been quietly cataloging for years aligned into something unmistakable. I had suspected long before that night, though I didn't admit it even to myself. I told myself the distance was normal, that marriage changes people, that priorities shift, that children grow up and parents are meant to step back. All the comforting lies we tell ourselves so we don't have to accept that sometimes stepping back means stepping away from someone who is actively being erased. The first time my son didn't return my call, I laughed it off. The fifth time, I blamed his schedule. By the 20th, I stopped calling and waited to see if he'd noticed the silence. He didn't. Or maybe he did and couldn't say anything about it. When I did see him, his words felt rehearsed, filtered, like every sentence had passed through someone else's approval process before it reached my ears. He avoided certain topics. He deflected personal questions. He smiled too quickly and laughed too softly, the way people do when they're trying not to draw attention to themselves. And every time I tried to speak to him alone, truly alone, she appeared within minutes, carrying drinks, asking questions, finishing his sentences. It wasn't overt enough to accuse. It never is. Control rarely arrives wearing a villain's face. It arrives disguised as care. I thought back to when he was younger, to the way he used to argue with me over everything from music to politics to the way I grilled steak. He was stubborn then, opinionated, fiercely independent. He once spent an entire summer rebuilding an old motorcycle engine just to prove he could do it without help. That man didn't vanish overnight. He was dismantled slowly, piece by piece, until what remained fit neatly inside someone else's expectations. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake long after that dinner ended, was realizing how long I'd watched it happen without naming it. After the toast that never was, conversation resumed awkwardly, like a car restarting after a stall. People laughed too loudly, avoided eye contact, pretended nothing unusual had occurred. My son kept his eyes on his plate. My daughter-in-law spoke animatedly to the people nearest her, telling a story, smiling, reclaiming the room. No one asked him why he stopped. No one asked her what she'd said. That's how silence becomes complicit, when everyone chooses comfort over curiosity. I sat there, hands folded, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the day his mother and I divorced, wondering whether this moment was the beginning of something ending or the end of something that had already been dead for years. I remembered the first time I felt uneasy around her, though at the time I brushed it aside as parental overprotectiveness. They had been dating only a few months, and we were having dinner at my house. My son mentioned casually that he'd turned down a job opportunity in another city, something he'd been excited about for years. Before he could explain why, she answered for him, listing reasons that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt strangely rehearsed. I noticed the way he nodded along, eyes down, letting her version replace his own. That was the first time I felt that subtle tightening in my chest, the one I now recognized as warning. After that night, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind, lining up like witnesses who had finally decided to speak. The way she insisted on handling all finances to reduce stress. The way friends slowly stopped visiting because she found reasons they were too negative. The way his phone was always face down when she was near. The way he flinched, not physically, but emotionally, whenever she corrected him in public. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And patterns tell stories, whether we want to hear them or not. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't pull him aside or demand answers or accuse her of anything. Fathers who rush rarely win. Instead, I watched. I listened. I took note of who spoke and who stayed silent. I saw how she controlled the narrative with ease, how she redirected attention whenever it strayed too close to him. I saw how he let it happen, not because he was weak, but because something inside him had learned that resistance came at a cost he could no longer afford to pay. And that realization hurt more than any anger could have. When the dinner ended and people began saying their goodbyes, she left ahead of him, keys already in hand, not waiting to see if he was ready. He followed a few steps behind, apologizing quietly to someone for something I couldn't hear. As they walked past me, I caught his eye for half a second. There was something there, an apology, a plea, a question, all tangled together. Then it was gone. The door closed. The room emptied. And I was left sitting in my chair, staring at a half-finished glass of water, knowing that the next part of this story wouldn't announce itself so politely. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because clarity has a way of keeping you awake. I replayed the whisper in my mind, not the words themselves. I'd never heard them, but the effect they had, the immediate obedience, the practiced silence, the finality of it. Whatever she'd said, it wasn't new. It was familiar, and that meant it had been said before, many times, in private, where no one could witness the damage. I realized then that if I wanted the truth, I couldn't ask for it directly. I'd have to uncover it the way all buried things are uncovered. Slowly, carefully, and with the understanding that once you start digging, you don't get to decide what you find. By morning, I had made a decision I didn't yet have words for. I wasn't going to confront. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to pay attention in a way I never had before. I was going to stop protecting the illusion of peace and start preparing for the reality of conflict. Because fathers don't just raise children, they bear witness to who those children become. And sometimes, bearing witness means standing still long enough for the truth to finally step into the light, even when you know it's going to hurt everyone involved. And as I sat at my kitchen table watching the sun rise, coffee untouched, one thought settled heavily in my mind, steady and unshakable. Whatever she had whispered into my son's ear that night, it wasn't the beginning of his silence. It was proof of how long it had already been there. The days after that dinner moved strangely, like time itself had slowed down just enough for me to notice things I'd once overlooked. Silence has a way of growing heavier when you finally stop pretending it's normal, and every unanswered message, every delayed response, every carefully worded excuse felt less like coincidence and more like architecture, something deliberately built over time. I didn't call my son immediately. That might sound cold, but it wasn't. It was strategic in the only way a father learns to be strategic when instinct alone is no longer enough. I needed to see how long it would take for him to notice my absence, to feel the gap the way I had been feeling his for years. Days passed, then a week. Nothing. And in that nothing, I began to understand the true reach of her influence. I started paying closer attention to the stories people told me about them, the offhand comments that used to slide past without friction. A neighbor mentioned they hadn't seen my son jogging in the mornings like he used to. A cousin joked that my daughter-in-law was basically running the household like a CEO. A family friend said, with a strange mix of admiration and discomfort, that she always knew exactly where my son was and who he was with. None of it sounded alarming on its own. That's how control survives. It hides inside compliments, wears the costume of competence, and convinces everyone watching that efficiency is the same thing as care. But when you stack those observations side by side, when you view them not as isolated anecdotes, but as parts of a larger pattern, a shape begins to emerge. And that shape is unmistakable once you've seen it. I thought back to the last real conversation I'd had with my son, months before the dinner, when he'd come over alone under the pretense of returning a tool he'd borrowed. He'd stood in my garage longer than necessary, shifting his weight, opening and closing his mouth like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the safe entry point. When I asked how he was doing, he said he was fine, quickly, too quickly. When I asked about work, he gave a summary that sounded more like a report than a reflection. And when I asked, gently, if everything was okay at home, his eyes flicked toward the driveway, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. That was the moment he'd left abruptly, citing an errand he'd forgotten. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. Now, I understood I'd been underreacting. Control doesn't arrive fully formed. It begins with suggestions framed as concern. It starts with, let me handle that for you. And this will be easier if I take care of it. And you don't need that stress right now. Slowly, responsibility shifts. Decisions become delegated. Independence becomes inconvenient. And before the person realizes what's happening, their life has been reorganized around someone else's comfort. I recognized this not because I'd lived it myself, but because I'd seen it happen to others, friends, co-workers, distant relatives. People who slowly shrank while insisting they were happy. The difference this time was that it was my son, and the realization landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. I decided to test something small, something harmless on the surface. I sent my son a message, not a call, not a confrontation. Just a simple note asking if he wanted to grab coffee. No urgency, no emotional weight. Hours passed, then a full day. When the response finally came, it wasn't in his voice. It was polite, distant, overly explanatory. He said his schedule was packed, that he'd get back to me, that things were just busy right now. The language felt filtered, like it had been passed through someone else's expectations before it reached me. And that was when I noticed something else: the timing. The message arrived late in the evening, long after I knew she'd be home. I wondered how many drafts had existed before that final version appeared on my screen. I began to recall moments when she'd subtly positioned herself as the gatekeeper between him and the rest of the world. Invitations routed through her, plans adjusted at her discretion, conflicts smoothed over by her explanations. At family gatherings, she often answered questions directed at him, not aggressively, but smoothly, as if it were simply more efficient that way. People laughed it off. I laughed it off. But efficiency, when it consistently silences one voice in favor of another, stops being a virtue. It becomes a warning sign. And I had ignored it for far too long. What unsettled me most wasn't her behavior alone, but his adaptation to it. He had learned when to speak and when not to. He had learned which opinions were safe and which ones were better left unexpressed. He had learned how to smile through discomfort and call it compromise. And that kind of learning doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, reinforced by consequences that are subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to shape behavior. I wondered how many times he'd try to push back, only to be met with emotional withdrawal, silent treatment, or carefully framed guilt. I wondered how many parts of himself he'd given up just to keep the peace. I didn't yet know what her leverage was, but I knew there had to be something more than personality alone. Control thrives on dependency. Financial, emotional, social, or psychological. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how intertwined their lives had become under her direction. She managed the finances. She coordinated social plans. She maintained contact with extended family. She even handled communication with his workplace more than once, something I'd found odd at the time but hadn't challenged. Each thread on its own looked innocuous. Together, they formed a net. I started keeping mental notes, then written ones. Dates, conversations, changes. I wasn't building a case in the legal sense, but I was assembling clarity. I remembered a holiday when my son had arrived without his phone, laughing awkwardly as he explained he'd left it at home because it was too distracting. She'd nodded approvingly beside him. At the time, it seemed like a healthy boundary. Now, I wondered who that boundary had really served. I remembered another time when he'd missed an important family event because she wasn't feeling well, even though photos later surfaced of her out with friends that same evening. He'd apologized profusely, shoulders hunched, voice quiet. No one questioned it. No one wanted to make things uncomfortable. The more I observed, the more I realized how well she understood social dynamics. She knew how to appear reasonable, how to frame every decision as practical, how to present herself as the responsible one while subtly undermining his autonomy. She never raised her voice in public. She never insulted him outright. Instead, she corrected, redirected, and reinterpreted. If he expressed frustration, she reframed it as stress. If he showed doubt, she labeled it insecurity. If he disagreed, she reminded him of everything she handled so he wouldn't have to. And over time, those reminders became debts he could never fully repay. I tried once more to reach him, this time by dropping by unannounced, something I'd done freely before their marriage. The house felt different now, less lived in, more curated. She answered the door, surprised but composed, blocking the entrance just enough to signal that this visit wasn't entirely welcome. She said my son was busy, that he was on a call, that now wasn't a good time. Her tone was polite, apologetic even, but firm. I asked if I could wait. She hesitated, then said it might be better if I called ahead next time. I realized then that I had become a guest in my son's life, subject to approval and scheduling like anyone else. As I drove away, a heavy truth settled over me. Whatever hold she had on him, it wasn't maintained through fear alone. It was maintained through conditioning, through the gradual reshaping of what felt normal, through the quiet rewriting of reality until questioning it felt like betrayal. And that meant that if I wanted to help him, I couldn't storm in and tear it apart. I couldn't demand he see what I saw. People under control rarely respond to force. They retreat further into the structure that feels familiar, even if it's suffocating. I needed patience. I needed timing. And most of all, I needed proof that spoke louder than my concern ever could. That night, I sat alone and thought about the whisper at the dinner, about how little it had taken to silence him completely. A single sentence, delivered quietly, without witnesses. Whatever she'd said, it had worked because it was rooted in something he believed, about himself, about their relationship, about what would happen if he didn't comply. Control doesn't rely on constant enforcement. It relies on internalized fear, on the certainty that stepping out of line will cost you something you're not prepared to lose. By the end of the week, I understood that this wasn't about one moment or one marriage. It was about a system that had been built carefully, deliberately, over years. And systems don't collapse on their own. They unravel when exposed to light, when contradictions surface, when the person trapped inside them is given a glimpse of life beyond the walls. I didn't yet know how that unraveling would begin, but I knew my role and it was changing. I was no longer just a father watching from the sidelines. I was a witness preparing to intervene, not with anger, not with accusations, but with truth. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one final thought lingered, sharp and unavoidable. My son hadn't sat down that night because he was weak. He had sat down because he had been trained to. And training can be undone, but only if the person being trained remembers, even for a moment, who they were before the lessons began. The first real crack didn't arrive with an argument or a confession. It arrived with something so ordinary most people would have ignored it. A bill. A simple, unremarkable envelope delivered to my mailbox 3 weeks after the dinner. The one where my son's hand shook, and my daughter-in-law silenced him with a whisper. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was another advertisement or charity request. But the return address caught my eye. It was from an insurance company, one my son and I had used years ago before he married her. The bill wasn't mine. It was addressed to him, using my street number, but his name. I opened it only because I recognized the formatting and knew mistakes like this were rare. Inside, I found a lapse notice. Their home insurance payment was overdue, 60 days overdue. That may not sound dramatic, but to someone who used to handle his finances meticulously, it spoke volumes. My son was never careless with money, not even in college. He tracked expenses, planned ahead, and avoided unnecessary debt. Yet here was a sign that something fundamental had shifted. Bills don't go unpaid when one partner is controlling and the other is thriving. They go unpaid when control has crossed the line into mismanagement or deprivation. It was the first objective piece of evidence that contradicted the image she projected, and it lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I sat with that envelope longer than I should have, reading the due dates, the warnings, the interest added. It wasn't a catastrophic bill yet, but it was a symptom, and symptoms rarely exist alone. I debated whether to call him immediately, but I could already hear the rehearsed explanations that would follow. Something about an oversight, a delay in statements, a glitch in the system. So instead, I filed it away carefully, the way someone documents early signs of illness before confronting a doctor. That night, I found myself thinking about the finances I once assumed they had under control. They drove a respectable car. They lived in a tidy home. They wore clothes that suggested comfort, not extravagance. From the outside, nothing looked strained. But the more I considered it, the more I realized I didn't actually know how much was real and how much was curated. People under control often maintain appearances long after their resources have dried up, because image becomes currency. And image, like credit, can be stretched dangerously thin. A few days later, I received another clue, not from paperwork this time, but from a conversation with my sister. She mentioned she had run into my daughter-in-law at a cafe and had been surprised to see her paying with 2 separate cards, one of which was declined before the second went through. My sister brushed it off as a technical glitch, but I didn't. When finances falter behind closed doors, control typically tightens, not loosens. And when control tightens, the relationship dynamic becomes more visible to those who look closely. I asked my sister whether my son had been with her. He hadn't. He was busy, That answer, too, felt familiar. The second crack appeared in the form of silence, this time his, not mine. After nearly 2 weeks without communication, I received a short text. Hey, sorry. Things have been hectic. Work is intense. We'll catch up soon. It was the kind of message you send when someone is standing over your shoulder. Polite, non-committal, carefully neutral. But one detail caught my attention. He didn't sign it with his usual initial or include any personal note. It lacked his voice. It felt like a placeholder. And placeholders are used when someone is buying time, not communicating. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't call. I let the silence sit, knowing that genuine cracks widen more effectively without pressure. Then came the third crack, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent decades reading my son's face. I saw him at a family gathering, a birthday party for my niece. I wasn't expecting him to attend. My daughter-in-law rarely let him participate in events she couldn't control. But he arrived alone, and that alone was enough to send a ripple through my thoughts. When I asked if she was joining, he said she was running late, though the slight upward twitch at the corner of his mouth suggested otherwise. He was nervous, glancing periodically toward the door, but there was also something else, an undercurrent of relief. It was faint, but it was there, relief at being somewhere she wasn't, even if just temporarily. We spoke briefly, surface-level topics at first. Work, weather, updates on distant cousins. His answers were short but less rehearsed than before, and when I asked how he really was, his eyes darted away, then back. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then muttered, "I'm fine, just tired." But the tone, this time, wasn't filtered. It cracked on the word tired in a way he wouldn't have allowed had she been standing beside him. And suddenly, it was clear, tired didn't mean busy. Tired meant worn down. Tired meant drained. Tired meant holding something that weighed too much for too long. We didn't get long. 10 minutes, at most. But in those 10 minutes, he asked something I hadn't heard from him in years. Do you think I made a mistake? The question was vague, rhetorical almost, but its intention was unmistakable. My heart clenched, not because I was surprised, but because I had been waiting for that sentence, waiting for him to acknowledge the uncertainty he had buried. Before I could respond, before I could offer anything resembling comfort or clarity, she walked in, and I watched the transformation happen in real time. Shoulders tightened, back straightened, jaw clenched, voice lowered. The relief evaporated, replaced by the controlled neutrality I had come to recognize as his armor. She didn't greet me when she approached. She greeted him, loudly, warmly, performatively. Then she slipped her arm through his and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. His expression answered for her. The crack I had glimpsed sealed itself, and he withdrew again. But cracks, once formed, don't vanish. They spread. The fourth crack came from a place I hadn't expected, his workplace. I stopped by the hardware store where my son worked part-time, something he had taken on to save for the future, a decision I once assumed was mutual. The manager, who had known my son since high school, asked casually if everything was okay. When I asked what he meant, the manager hesitated, weighing professional boundaries against personal concern. He finally said that my son had been distracted lately, forgetting tasks, arriving late more often, and taking extended breaks. He emphasized that my son wasn't being reprimanded. He was worried. He said my son looked exhausted, thinner, more strained than he remembered. That conversation hit me hard. Men don't lose themselves solely through emotional manipulation. It takes sustained pressure to create that level of withdrawal. It takes financial strain, isolation from support systems, and constant emotional cost. It takes a person who knows how to maintain control without leaving bruises or scars that the world can see. And yet, despite the invisibility of the damage, it was beginning to surface in his fatigue, in his performance, in his silence. The fifth crack came unexpectedly when I received a late-night phone call from an unknown number. It was my son. His voice was low, unsteady, as if he were speaking from inside a small space. He said he had stepped outside to get some air and had only a minute. He didn't say what was wrong. He didn't need to. I could hear it, in the tremor beneath his words, in the way he chose them cautiously, like navigating a minefield. He asked if I could meet him sometime that week, alone. He emphasized the word alone. Before I could answer, before I could ask anything, I heard a door open on his end, footsteps, and then the call ended abruptly. No goodbye, no explanation, just a click. I stared at the phone long after the screen went dark, heart pounding, realizing that whatever was happening had escalated beyond concern. Cracks had become fractures. The sixth crack arrived the next morning, not from him, but from her. She called me. Polite voice, controlled tone. She said she wanted to clear the air after the dinner. She said she hoped I didn't misinterpret the moment. She said my son was just emotional, that he tends to overthink, that he appreciated her support. Each phrase was carefully selected, not to explain, but to rewrite. She didn't ask what I thought. She told me what I should believe. And beneath the politeness, I could hear it. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of losing control. Fear of a narrative slipping. Fear of a crack widening. The call wasn't a courtesy. It was damage control. By then, the pattern was undeniable. Financial strain. Social isolation. Emotional scripting. Behavioral changes. Workplace decline. Secret communication. And now, panic disguised as politeness. For years, my daughter-in-law had maintained control through subtlety, predictability, efficiency. But now, she was reacting. And reactions reveal vulnerability. 2 days later, I saw my son again, this time by arrangement, at a cafe far from their home. He arrived late, anxious, checking over his shoulder before sitting. The moment he sat down, his facade crumbled. His hands trembled again, just like at the dinner. He didn't speak immediately. He stared at the table, breathing unsteadily, gathering courage from someplace inside himself. Finally, he said the words that confirmed everything I feared and everything I suspected. Dad, I don't think I'm allowed to live my own life anymore. Allowed. Not able. Not choosing. Allowed. And in that moment, the cracks I had observed were no longer theoretical. They were confession. He told me, in small pieces, about the control, the management of money, the monitoring of messages, the discouragement of friendships, the surveillance disguised as concern. He didn't call it abuse. He didn't call it manipulation. He didn't label it. Victims seldom do. They describe symptoms, not diagnoses. He said he felt like a guest in his own marriage. He said decisions were made for him, not with him. He said he had tried to leave once, but she threatened financial ruin, social shame, and something else, something he refused to say. When I asked what she threatened, he looked away. His face tightened. His voice dropped. And he whispered, "She said she'd destroy what I'm most afraid to lose." That sentence chilled me more than any detail could have, because control is never absolute unless it has leverage. He didn't tell me what that leverage was. Not yet. But I didn't push him. Cracks cannot be forced open. They expand when pressure beneath them becomes unsustainable. And now, pressure was building, not from me, but from reality. When we left the cafe, he didn't hug me. He couldn't. He was too afraid of someone seeing. But he paused before walking away and said, quietly, "I might need your help. Just not yet." And that was enough. Because cracks, once acknowledged, not just seen, are irreversible. And now, the unraveling had begun. In the days after that cafe meeting, I moved through my life the way you move through a house at night when you're trying not to wake anyone. Carefully, slowly, aware that every sound might matter. My son's words replayed themselves in my mind at odd moments. In the grocery aisle, while I was washing dishes, when the television was on, but I wasn't really watching. I don't think I'm allowed to live my own life anymore. That sentence settled over everything like a film, changing the color of even the most ordinary details. I had always known something was wrong. Now I knew he knew it too. That changed everything. You can ignore what you suspect, but not what has been confessed to you, even in fragments. And then there was the line that wouldn't let me sleep. She said she'd destroy what I'm most afraid to lose. People don't make threats like that unless they're sure they can make good on them. I started mentally cataloging everything I knew about his life, the way you might spread puzzle pieces across a table to see which sections you could complete first. Finances, home, work, relationships. What was he afraid to lose? I knew my son. Money alone was never his greatest fear. He had been broke in college and laughed through cheap meals and secondhand clothes. Status wasn't it either. He didn't care about being admired by strangers. His pride, maybe, but even that, I suspected, had been worn down over years of control. No, what he feared losing had to be something deeper, something that touched the parts of him that had always been vulnerable. Family, trust, reputation, the ability to look in the mirror and not hate the man staring back. Whatever leverage she held, it was rooted in one of those things, and probably wrapped in a layer of guilt thick enough to keep him from questioning it. I didn't have to wait long for another piece of the puzzle, though I hadn't expected it to arrive the way it did. A few days after our cafe conversation, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize, one of those generic notification emails from an online portal. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but the subject line froze me. Policy change confirmation. My finger hovered over the trash icon, then moved instead to open. It was a notification from the same insurance company that had accidentally mailed my son's lapse notice to my address. According to the email, the contact information on the account had been changed, my son's phone number removed, a new one added, his email address replaced. The primary contact was now listed solely in his wife's name, even though the policy still had his as the primary insured. It was a small detail, the kind most people would shrug off. But to me, it screamed. Control over information is control over consequences. If he didn't even receive notices about the roof over his head, he couldn't make decisions about it. And if he couldn't make decisions about it, he was no longer a partner. He was a dependent. I called the insurance company, pretending to be confused about the email. The representative, polite and efficient, confirmed the changes were made online and that my son's contact details had indeed been removed from the primary notification settings. When I asked who authorized the changes, the representative said they could not disclose that information but assured me it had been done by someone with account access. That was all I needed to hear. Someone with access. Someone who had likely insisted on managing those details 2 years ago, under the guise of simplifying things. Someone who now controlled the flow of information so completely that my son wouldn't even know if his safety net failed. The leverage wasn't just emotional. It was structural. Still, that didn't fully explain the depth of fear I'd heard in my son's voice. Money and paperwork mattered, yes, but they weren't his deepest vulnerability. I kept circling back to what he had refused to say at the cafe. She said she'd destroy what I'm most afraid to lose. If money wasn't it, and status wasn't it, then it had to be something closer to the bone. Something about his name, his integrity, his sense of himself as a good man. And that's when a darker possibility began to take shape in my mind, one I didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore: accusations. In the world we live in, a single accusation, even unproven, can shatter a person's life faster than any financial loss. It can poison friendships, end careers, fracture families. It doesn't have to be true to be effective as a threat. It only has to be believable. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I remembered subtle comments she had made in the past, hints dropped about his temper when he was simply stressed, playful remarks in front of others about him, getting loud sometimes, that were delivered with a laugh, but carried a particular tone. At the time, they had sounded like offhand jokes, the kind couples sometimes make without thinking. Now, they looked more like groundwork being laid. If she ever needed to paint him as dangerous, unstable, or untrustworthy, she had already planted the seeds. She could water them whenever convenient. I couldn't accuse her of that without proof, but I could test it. I decided to do something simple, something that would seem harmless on the surface. I invited them both to dinner. I chose a neutral location, a restaurant, not my home, so no one could claim I was trying to corner them. When I sent the invitation, my son responded with a hesitant yes, followed quickly by a message from her: "We'd love to. Things have been tense lately. It will be good to reset." That word, reset, made my stomach twist. You reset a device when you don't like how it's functioning. You reset a game when the outcome isn't going your way. You don't reset people. But then, she never really treated him like a whole person, only as something to be directed. The night of the dinner, I arrived early and chose a table where I could see the door clearly. They came in together, her hand on his arm, his posture slightly hunched as though bracing for impact. She greeted me with a bright smile, overly warm, almost theatrical. He nodded, eyes briefly meeting mine with something that looked like apology and resignation mixed together. From the moment we sat down, she steered the conversation. She asked about my health, my work, my hobbies. She laughed at her own anecdotes. She complimented the restaurant choice. My son spoke only in short answers, expanding only when I looked directly at him and asked him something specific. At one point, when she got up to use the restroom, the air shifted slightly. It was as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. My son's shoulders loosened a fraction. His jaw unclenched. I didn't waste the moment. Quietly, I leaned forward and said, "You said you might need my help. That offer still stands. But I need to understand what she's holding over you." His eyes filled with panic immediately, darting toward the direction she'd gone. "Dad, don't," he whispered. "Please. Not here." His hand gripped the edge of the table. "She'll know? She always knows." "Knows what?" I asked quietly. "That you spoke to your father? That you're tired of feeling like you're on a leash?" He looked at me like I'd slapped him. Not because I was wrong, but because I was too close to a truth he wasn't ready to hear out loud. "You don't understand," he muttered. "She said if I ever tried to turn anyone against her, she'd—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "She'd say something," he finished weakly, eyes dropping. "Something that would ruin everything." Accusations. It had to be. Nothing else fit the level of terror in his voice. Before I could press further, she returned. And just like that, the atmosphere closed again. She slid back into her seat, offered another bright comment, and my son shut down. I watched them, then made a choice. If she wanted to test her control, I would test its limits. I waited for a moment when the conversation lulled, then said calmly, "You know, I got a strange piece of mail recently. Insurance lapse notice. For your house." I watched her face carefully. For a fraction of a second, something flashed, a brief, sharp calculation, before she smiled. "Oh, that," she said lightly, shooting my son a quick look that wasn't light at all. "Just a mix-up. We handled it. The system didn't update after we changed the payment method." "Funny," I replied, still calm. "When I called them, they said the contact information had been changed too. Your phone number is the only one on file now." I turned my gaze to my son. "Is that what you wanted, son?" He swallowed hard. She didn't miss a beat. "Of course it's what he wanted," she said. "He hates dealing with that kind of stuff. I've been handling most of the paperwork. It's just easier that way." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were not. There was steel there, hidden under the varnish. "You know how he is," she added, with a soft laugh. "Always losing mail, forgetting deadlines. I'm just keeping us on track." I looked at my son, not her. "Is that true?" I asked quietly. "Is that how you want things? You okay with not getting notified when your own house is at risk?" His lips parted, closed, parted again. I could see the war behind his eyes. The desire to tell the truth. The fear of the consequences. The tug-of-war between loyalty and survival. "He trusts me." She cut in sharply, a fraction too fast. "That's what marriage is, right? Trust." The word felt like a weapon in her mouth. She reached for his hand on the table, placing her fingers over his knuckles, more like a clamp than a caress. "We're a team." He didn't pull away. That hurt more than if he had, because it showed me how deep the conditioning ran. He wasn't just afraid of her. He believed, on some level, that speaking against her would make him the disloyal one. And that, I finally understood, was her greatest leverage. Not just what she could accuse him of, but what she had already convinced him to accuse himself of if he resisted. Being ungrateful, being unstable, being the problem. The rest of the dinner passed in strained politeness. We talked about safe topics. We avoided specifics. She smiled. He stayed quiet. I paid the bill. When we stood to leave, she hugged me, the gesture just a bit too tight, her lips close to my ear as she whispered, "He's been under a lot of stress. I hope you won't add to it with concerns that aren't helpful." The message was clear. Don't stir the water. Let my version of reality stand. I didn't respond. I simply stepped back and nodded. But inside, I made another decision. Until that moment, I had been observing, collecting, trying to understand the shape of the prison my son was living in. I had hoped, quietly, that recognition alone would be enough to make him push against the bars. But now I saw. He was too deep inside the story she'd written for him to see the exit. Whatever accusations she had threatened, whatever shame she had promised to unleash, they were chained tightly to his sense of self. If he left, he wouldn't just be abandoning a marriage. He'd be walking into a storm of carefully planted narratives about who he was. And he was terrified that even I might believe her if she told them. As we walked out into the parking lot, our breaths visible in the cool air, my son lingered for a second while she fumbled with her keys. In that brief pocket of time, I stepped closer and spoke quietly, so only he could hear. "Listen to me," I said. "Whatever she has threatened to say about you, whatever story she's promised to spread, I don't care what it is. I know you. I raised you. There is nothing she can say that will make me stand against you. Do you understand?" His eyes filled instantly, the way they had when he was small, and fell hard but tried not to cry. He gave a barely perceptible nod, then turned away when she called his name. They drove off, taillights disappearing into the dark. I stood there in the parking lot longer than I should have, hands in my pockets, heart pounding, feeling the weight of the shift inside me. I was no longer waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I was going to bring it into the open. Not recklessly, not in a way that would leave him alone in the wreckage, but in a way that would make it impossible for her to keep pretending she held all the power. The leverage she thought she had over him depended on one thing: isolation. The belief that if she destroyed his name, no one would stand beside him. That belief, I realized, was her weak point, because I was still here. And now, I was done being silent. I went home that night knowing something with painful clarity. The next move wouldn't belong to her. It would belong to me. I didn't wake up the next morning with a grand plan. People like to believe turning points arrive with trumpets, with certainty, with the kind of conviction that propels you out of bed and into action. But the truth is more subtle than that. Transformations begin quietly, often while you are making coffee, brushing your teeth, or staring at a calendar that suddenly looks unfamiliar. For me, it came when I stood in my kitchen, pouring coffee I didn't feel like drinking, thinking about the whisper in that parking lot, the one where she told me not to add concerns that weren't helpful. It wasn't the warning that affected me as much as the assumption beneath it, that I was someone who could be intimidated by polite threats. I realized then that she had never really understood me. She assumed my restraint was weakness when, in fact, it was strategy. I had been waiting because I knew timing mattered, but now timing had arrived. And once a father decides to intervene, not out of anger, but out of clarity, change becomes inevitable. I didn't rush into confrontation. Instead, I began where control is most vulnerable: truth gathering. Not accusations. Evidence. The first place I looked was the insurance account that had triggered my suspicion. I requested a mailed statement under the pretense of needing documentation for family planning, and when it arrived, it confirmed what the notifications had suggested: late payments, contact changes, automatic withdrawals from an account that didn't bear my son's name. It was small, but it was a thread. And threads, when pulled carefully, unravel tapestries. Next, I reached out to an old friend of my son's, someone he had been inseparable from before his marriage. Their friendship had drifted afterward, a fact I had chalked up to adulthood and responsibilities. But when I contacted him, he admitted something I wasn't prepared for. He had tried to stay in touch. He had called, texted, invited, reached out repeatedly. And every time, my son declined or failed to respond. When I asked if he ever spoke to my daughter-in-law, his voice changed. He said she had once told him, politely, that my son was too busy for old friendships, and that he should respect boundaries. That's when the friend stopped reaching out, not because he didn't care, but because he believed my son had changed. That was isolation dressed as boundaries. It wasn't overt control, it was engineered distance. And I realized then that my son hadn't been withdrawing by choice. He had been strategically cut off, from me, from friends, from independent finances, until he existed in a world where she was the only constant. That wasn't partnership. That was dependency achieved through social starvation. Once I saw that clearly, I moved to the workplace, knowing that professional environments reveal strain differently. I spoke to his manager again, this time more intentionally. He admitted my son had recently requested reduced hours, not for relaxation, but because of work-life balance. The phrase sounded rehearsed. My son had always been ambitious, not in a reckless way, but in a way that made him proud of his contribution. Reduced hours didn't fit. When I asked if he had mentioned financial concerns, the manager frowned and said my son had declined a small promotion 3 months earlier, claiming it would complicate things at home. Promotions don't complicate things unless someone else is threatened by a partner gaining independence or confidence. I thought then about accusations, how she might use them. The threat of destroying everything wasn't theoretical anymore. If she could isolate him, weaken him financially, frame him as unstable socially, and undermine his confidence, she could make any accusation seem plausible. Not necessarily true, but believable enough to serve her purpose. And belief, not truth, is what reputations hinge on. That realization led me to my next step, understanding her network. Control doesn't exist in a vacuum. It relies on allies, or at least on perceptions. So I attended a charity event she frequented, blending into the crowd. I observed how she interacted, calm, charming, articulate. She was respected. People listened when she spoke. And I saw how she subtly used conversational redirection to paint herself as the stable partner, the organized spouse, the supportive figure. I watched her glide through the room with the ease of someone who knew she held social capital. And for the first time, I understood why my son hesitated to speak out. He feared not being believed, because she had curated credibility long before he recognized the danger. But even curated facades have cracks. I saw one when she cornered an acquaintance and spoke sharply, too sharply, about unnecessary interference regarding a harmless question about her husband's work. Her tone shifted from polite to territorial within seconds. The acquaintance recoiled slightly, and though she masked it quickly, I had seen it. People who are secure don't react defensively to benign inquiries. That defensiveness suggested she was protecting something brittle, something that couldn't withstand scrutiny. I realized then that she wasn't as invincible as she appeared. Control had made her confident, but fear had made her reactive. And reactions create mistakes. My son contacted me again 3 days later. This time, not from a restricted number. His voice was steadier, though still cautious. He asked if we could meet, not at a cafe, but at a park near his old high school. The place where he had learned to ride a bicycle, where I had taught him how to throw a baseball, where we used to sit on the bleachers and talk about life. When he arrived, he looked thinner. His eyes had dark circles beneath them. But there was something else, resolve. Fragile, yes, but present. He didn't sit right away. He paced for a moment, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the ground like he was rehearsing. Then he sat beside me and said softly, "She threatened to accuse me of hurting her." The words landed with a weight I felt physically, like a punch to the gut. He didn't need to elaborate. I understood immediately. If he left, if he exposed her, if he sought help, she would claim he had abused her. And in the world we live in, where justice is often determined by who speaks first or most convincingly, that threat was potent. It didn't matter whether it was true. The fear of the accusation was enough to keep him compliant. I asked him if he had ever hurt her. He shook his head violently. "Never," he said. "Never. I swear. I'm not that person." And in that moment, I saw the terror, not of consequences, but of identity. He was afraid of being perceived as a monster. And she knew that. She weaponized his integrity against him. It was brilliant, in a cruel way. She didn't threaten physical retaliation. She threatened character assassination, the kind that would follow him for years, perhaps forever. And suddenly everything made sense. The silence, the obedience, the isolation. He wasn't staying because he loved her. He was staying because he feared what leaving would turn him into in the eyes of the world. I didn't comfort him with empty reassurances. I didn't say no one would believe her, because people might. I didn't say you'll be fine, because he might not. Instead, I told him something true. Accusations only stick when the accused stands alone. You are not alone. He looked at me, eyes glossy and whispered, "But what if she says it? What if she ruins my life?" I answered, "Then we confront it with evidence, with character witnesses, with patterns, with history. And we do it together. She has prepared a narrative. We prepare truth." He exhaled shakily, like someone who had been underwater and finally surfaced. And then he said something that showed me the crack in her power was growing. "I want to leave, but I need to do it without giving her a reason to act." That was the moment I knew intervention wasn't just necessary, it was possible. Because he wasn't asking if he could leave. He was asking how. I spent the next week quietly gathering. Not secrets. Facts. Dates. Statements. Witnesses. I spoke to friends who had drifted away. I reviewed financial records he still had access to. I documented changes in behavior. I took notes on interactions. I wasn't building a case for court. I was building a foundation for self-defense. Because if she struck first, we needed credibility. If she panicked, we needed clarity. And if she followed through on her threat, we needed proof of her pattern. During that week, my son began to pull away from her in small, almost invisible ways. Ways only someone watching closely would notice. He stopped handing her his phone automatically. He paid for groceries himself. He spent one evening in the guest room, citing exhaustion. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But inside, the dynamic was shifting. She sensed it. And control, when threatened, often overreaches. Her overreach came during a family gathering. Another dinner, though not as formal as the anniversary one. She dominated the conversation as always, but this time, her tone lacked polish. She criticized small things. She corrected my son in front of others. She dismissed his attempt to speak about work, cutting him off mid-sentence. And in doing so, she exposed herself, not to everyone, but to those who cared to see. Eyes drifted. Expressions tightened. A cousin leaned toward her husband and whispered. Afterward, quietly, that cousin approached me and said, "Is everything okay with them? She seems tense." The facade had slipped. Not entirely, but enough that others saw a glimpse of the strain beneath the surface. My son noticed it too. Later that night, he texted me, "She's getting nervous. I think she knows I'm changing." I replied, "Good. Fear means her narrative is losing stability." The next step was inevitable, an attempt to reclaim dominance. It came in the form of a sudden romantic getaway she planned without his input. A trip designed to isolate him again, to press reset, to remind him of her control. But he resisted, gently, strategically. He said work obligations made it impossible. She didn't argue immediately, but the tension between them was no longer invisible. And when control senses rebellion, it prepares for escalation. The escalation arrived during the toast. The moment he stood, glass trembling, ready to speak, not to confess wrongdoing, but to assert autonomy. She sensed it instantly and intervened. She whispered a threat, the same leverage she had used before. And he sat. But this time, the room saw something. Not the full truth, but enough to question. Enough that her command didn't look like support. It looked like silencing. And while she didn't realize it, her greatest mistake had just been made. She revealed control publicly. That moment told me the end was near, not because he had spoken, but because she had panicked. Control without confidence becomes desperation. And desperation leads to errors. I walked away from that night knowing something I had never allowed myself to believe fully until then. The narrative she built was fragile. It didn't thrive under scrutiny. It thrived under silence. And silence, now, was cracking. The unraveling had begun, not through confrontation, but through revelation. And soon, the final chapter would arrive. Not with violence, but with truth. Looking back now, I realized the toast was not the moment everything fell apart. It was the moment everything became undeniable. The real unraveling happened afterward, in the quiet spaces where panic can no longer hide behind charm. For her, the whisper at the anniversary dinner was meant to be a last line of defense, a reminder of the leverage she believed she still possessed. For him, it was the sharp sting of a threat he had obeyed for too long. And for me, it was confirmation that our strategy had worked. She was no longer composed. She was reactive. When someone who relies on control begins to lose it, they often tighten their grip so quickly and so desperately that the act itself becomes visible. And visibility, more than any confrontation, is what ultimately ended her illusion of power. The morning after the dinner, I received a call from my son. His voice shook, not with fear this time, but with adrenaline. He said she had been furious the night before, accusing him of trying to embarrass her in front of family. When he tried to explain that he wasn't planning to expose anything, merely to speak for himself for once, she twisted it, saying he was unstable, that he was acting irrational, that she'd have to protect herself if he insisted on making scenes. That phrase, protect herself, wasn't just a warning. It was a rehearsal. She was preparing to weaponize the accusation she had threatened before. But something had changed. This time, my son didn't fold immediately. He didn't apologize on instinct. Instead, he asked her a question he had never dared to ask. Protect yourself from what? And when she didn't answer him directly, because she couldn't state her threat plainly without exposing its emptiness, he saw something he hadn't seen before. He saw her hesitate. Hesitation, to someone who has lived under control, feels like air entering a sealed room. He told me, with a trembling voice, that for a brief moment, he understood the truth. Her power depended not on the threat itself, but on his belief in it. It wasn't a full break. He didn't walk out that night. He didn't push her to confess. But the dynamic shifted. He stopped responding automatically. He questioned. He pushed back. And she, sensing the change, escalated. Escalation in relationships like theirs rarely looks dramatic. It looks petty. She began criticizing him constantly. His tone, his punctuality, his phrasing. She insisted on managing every detail of their lives, even more tightly than before. She monitored his phone, demanded schedules, made passive-aggressive comments about loyalty. She framed herself as the victim, saying he was acting differently, making her anxious, withdrawing affection. That narrative, while superficially sympathetic, had one fatal flaw. It was too sudden. People who had quietly questioned her before began noticing the shift. Her mask slipped not because she screamed or threw things, but because her carefully cultivated composure began cracking around the edges. I watched from the outside, patient and present. He would call me late at night, sometimes whispering from the garage or his car. He admitted he was afraid of provoking her. But fear, once named aloud, loses its total grip. Slowly, he began reconnecting with people she had kept him from, an old friend, a cousin, even a colleague. Each reconnection became another thread she could no longer sever without revealing her intent. And as those threads strengthened, her isolation tactics weakened. She couldn't be everywhere at once. She couldn't monitor every conversation. She couldn't silence every moment of doubt. And doubt, when shared, becomes truth's ally. The breaking point arrived on a weekday afternoon, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a bureaucratic misstep. My son received a message from the insurance company because, after our meeting, he had called them privately and added his number back to the account. The message informed him that the insurance had lapsed again. This time, not by mistake, but because payments had bounced. He confronted her with this information, asking why the mortgage and insurance accounts were underfunded when she had always insisted their finances were stable. She tried to deflect, claiming it was a minor oversight. But when he pressed, truly pressed, refusing to let the subject drop, she snapped. She told him he had no right to question her. She said she had sacrificed for him. She lashed out verbally, accusing him of incompetence, of ingratitude, of instability. And then, in her fury, she made a mistake. She told him that if he ever left her, she would accuse him of abuse. Not threaten, not imply. She said it plainly. He recorded it, not because he planned to, because he had become accustomed to recording notes and reminders while working on house repairs. His phone was in his pocket, and when she started yelling, he hit record without even thinking. When he listened to it later, he understood the magnitude of what he had captured, the leverage she believed she held, stated aloud. Evidence of intent. It wasn't proof of innocence, but it was proof of coercion. He came to me with it. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted. He said, "Dad, I didn't want to use this. I didn't want to trap her. I needed to know I wasn't crazy." I needed to know I wasn't imagining the threat. I told him what I had been waiting to say for months. This isn't about trapping her. It's about freeing yourself. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw something I hadn't seen in him in a long time. Resolve without fear. He didn't confront her immediately. He didn't storm out or wave the recording in her face. That would have been dangerous. Instead, he spoke to a lawyer, quietly, discreetly. He asked questions. He explored options. He learned, painfully, that false accusations are possible, but also that prior documentation of coercion, manipulation, financial control, and witness testimony could protect him. He learned that leaving suddenly could provoke her, but leaving strategically could neutralize her threat. When he finally confronted her, it wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. He told her he wanted a separation. He said it calmly, without anger. He said he needed space. She reacted as we expected, hysterically at first, then with cold calculation. She tried to guilt him. She tried to threaten him. She tried to manipulate him. And when those tactics failed, she attempted to invoke the accusation. But when she did, he played the recording. The moment she heard her own words echoed back, she froze. Because coercion is powerful when spoken in private. But when a recording exists, her leverage collapses. She didn't apologize. She didn't fight. She went silent. In that silence, the power dynamic reversed. He walked out, not to a hotel, but to my house. I expected him to collapse in relief, but instead he sat at my kitchen table, put his head in his hands, and cried, not because he was still afraid, but because the weight of years of control was finally lifting. When people speak of liberation, they forget that freedom is heavy at first. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, she attempted damage control. She reached out to family, claiming he was confused, unstable, manipulated. But the cracks in her credibility, visible to others at the dinner, in the escalating interactions, in her unguarded frustrations, had already taken root. Combined with the financial evidence, the sudden change in tone, and the recording that he was prepared to present if necessary, she found herself with less support than she expected. Isolation had been her tactic. Now, it was her consequence. The divorce process was not easy. It never is. There were hearings. There were accusations. Less severe than she had once threatened, but malicious nonetheless. But truth has a way of accumulating. And the recording, combined with testimony from friends and family who had observed changes, combined with financial irregularities, combined with my son's documented efforts to seek help, all of it formed a counterweight to her narrative. She had expected control would translate into credibility. But credibility requires consistency, and her composure had cracked too many times. The judge didn't frame it as abuse. They framed it as coercive control. And in doing so, they stripped her of the power she believed she would always wield. The settlement favored my son, not dramatically, but fairly. He walked away, not wealthy, not triumphant, but whole. And somewhere in that process, something shifted between us. He went from calling me quietly in fear to speaking plainly, openly, without shame. He apologized for the distance. I told him he owed me nothing. He had survived, and that was enough. Months later, we sat together again at a family dinner. Someone raised a glass. My son didn't shake. He looked at me, not seeking approval, but sharing acknowledgement. He spoke, not rehearsed, not silenced, but freely. He didn't speak of her. He didn't speak of the past. He said, simply, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And in that moment, I understood something essential. Control doesn't break in a single dramatic moment. It fractures slowly, cracks quietly, collapses under truth and support. And healing doesn't look like triumph. It looks like a man lifting a glass without trembling. It looks like a son speaking without fear. It looks like a father who watched, waited, intervened, and refused to be silent. It looks like peace, earned painfully, held carefully. And for the first time in years, it looked like a future neither of us feared.